Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Genevieve Wood, Senior Communications Advisor here at the Heritage Foundation, and on behalf of all my colleagues here at Heritage, welcome to the 5th Annual Anti-Poverty Forum. We're delighted to host it here at Heritage this year, and it's great to see so many familiar faces and many of you here this morning. You know, Washington has been fighting the war on poverty for decades, and as many of you know, and sadly as many Americans across the country know who are suffering in poverty, the numbers haven't really changed. Despite $1 trillion or over $1 trillion in spending, many government programs, the federal poverty stats today are very similar to what they were in the 1960s. And unfortunately, when we look for answers, we're often given more of the same. And that's because Washington has a way of measuring success by the number of dollars spent, the number of programs created, but often overlooking, are these programs, are these dollars actually helping the very people we've intended for these programs and dollars to help? Well, that's why we're wanting to change some of that discussion this morning. And the theme of our forum is refocusing policy for the good of people. And such an effort, of course, involves policy experts, involves lawmakers, it involves community leaders, and you're going to hear from many of those very folks here this morning. Our first two sessions this morning will be moderated by Jennifer Marshall, my colleague here at Heritage. Jennifer is the Vice President of Heritage's Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity, where she oversees a variety of issues that contribute to and determine the strength and character of American society. Several of those issues, welfare, healthcare, and education, are topics we're going to explore this morning during our discussions and panels. Jennifer's team also produces the annual Index of Culture and Opportunity, and if many of you have not picked it up, we have copies of it outside. We encourage you to take a look at that. The index, for those who are not familiar, tracks key social and economic trends to determine whether important indicators of opportunity in America are on the right track. The good news is some are. The bad news is some aren't. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Jennifer Marshall, who's going to moderate our two first panels this morning.
Well, good morning. This is one of my favorite days of the year, and one of the reasons is that it brings together so many friends who have worked together over the years on these issues of fighting poverty. And it brings together many newcomers to the conversation as well, and so we welcome you this year. And we're all coming with different histories of engagement with the issue of poverty, but what we're here today to talk about is the fact that we want to change the way that we approach poverty in the United States. We share a conviction that the welfare state status quo has not done justice to those in need. Too often, our anti-poverty programs are really focused exclusively on material needs, and they end up reducing human beings to their material desires and needs. But we're gathered here today because we believe that effective compassion has to start with a proper understanding of human dignity and the fact that it goes much more deep than mere material need. We've had fleeting moments of getting anti-poverty policy right. The 1996 welfare reform is one prime example. But that's now more than 20 years ago, and we have a lot of work to do. Those of you who have come to this conference in the past know that I refer to these as our staccato note successes. That is, we've had these fleeting moments when we got poverty right, and we can look at an effort and say, that's it. That's what it means to do justice to human dignity in the way that we fight poverty. But we've never had a clear melody that people can pick up on and carry the tune of how to really help people overcome poverty and dependence. And instead, the dominant anti-poverty tune has been one that calls for more federal funding and more federal programs. Same old tune. Now we have new leadership in Washington, and this is an extraordinary opportunity for us to change that tune of how we approach poverty in America. So for this first panel today, we have brought together 3 members of Congress who are focused on 3 different legislative components of a comprehensive welfare reform agenda that would begin to do what I'm talking about here this morning. So I'd like to invite them to join me here on stage to have a conversation about this as I introduce the 3 of them. Congressman Jim Jordan represents Ohio's 4th District, and he has been in Congress since 2007. In the 114th Congress, Representative Jordan helped found the House Freedom Caucus and served as its first chairman. Congressman Garrett Graves has represented Louisiana's 6th district since 2015, and he and his family live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Congressman Jason Smith hails from Salem, Missouri, where he still owns the farm that's been in his family for 4 generations, which is great. He serves on the Ways and Means Committee. Please join me in welcoming these congressmen here today. Well, welcome. As you probably heard, I referred to changing the tune in my opening remarks. We're not going to ask anybody to sing here this morning, but we do think that the kinds of things you're focusing on are the right notes that will catch on with Americans. And so we do want to highlight the good work that you've been doing in terms of focusing on welfare reform priorities that really matter and could make a great deal of difference for Americans in need across the country. So, Congressman Jordan, I want to begin with you because we've been in this conversation for a number of years, and this is an extraordinary opportunity in front of us. But you've got a piece of legislation that really is pretty broad in its ambitions, and I wonder if you could just start characterizing that for us.
We want to know how much money we're spending on welfare. So what's the aggregate amount we spend on the, I think Robert said before, 79, 80 different means-tested social welfare programs we have, and we want to incentivize work. You mentioned in your opening comments, Jennifer, about dignity. There's dignity in work, and right now we don't incentivize that like we should. I shared this story, I think for the first time here at Heritage a couple years ago. But just do this little exercise. Imagine, go back and remember, actually, the first job you ever had. Very first job you had, where you know, babysitting the kid next door, where you're delivering papers, or you're working in the restaurant as a waiter or waitress. For me, it was baling hay, and Jason probably had to do a little bit of that on his farm as well. And it was mowing country lawns. My brother and I had a little lawn mowing business. And think about the values and the principles you learned in the very first job you had. I think what we're doing today is robbing people of that experience and the lessons you learned in that very first job, where you were making less than minimum wage, but you were learning a skill set that helped you get to a better position in life. We mowed 25 country lawns. I remember people would find out we did that. They'd call the house, and this is back in the day when you had one phone with the cord. And we'd try to get to, if we were home, we'd try to get to the phone first, because my dad, if he got the phone, he would never turn down a job if someone wanted us to mow their lawn. We were like, we got enough. We don't want any. But you learn a set of values. I still remember my dad. I'll get you the old truck. We had this trailer. We had a riding mower, push mower, weed eater, toolbox. We looked like the Beverly Hillbillies going down the road. But he said, I'll get you started, but you're going to pay for things after that. You're going to pay for the gas, and you screw around and break belts and pulleys. You're going to have to fix that. So you learn to manage resources. You learn to schedule. But what you really learned was how to deal with people. I always, you know, we were busy and we had to get all these done. But I remember the Steinberger sisters, 2 sisters who never married. We'd mow their lawn. Normally you'd pull in and you'd just get right after it. You'd unload and get to work. But we quickly learned with the Steinberger sisters, if you took time when you first got there to go up and talk to them, about the time you were finishing, kind of trimming around the house, you could smell the chocolate chip cookies that they were making. And so you learn the people skill. But I would argue what we've done with our welfare system for the last 50 years is discourage work and discourage people from learning, as I said before, the skills we all got in the first job. What we try to do in the various legislation that we've sponsored is to re-incentivize that and bring back the dignity of work and how that helps people get to a better position and station in life.
Great. Thank you. Congressman Graves, you've been focused particularly on the issue of food stamps, the SNAP program. And that's a program that's grown massively in recent years. Can you give us an idea of the scope and what the challenges are within it?
Sure. So when you look back, 1996, as you noted, you had welfare reform. You even had President Clinton, you had Senator Ted Kennedy at the time involved in the reform. There was a decision at the time to have a work requirement associated with the SNAP program, and it yielded benefits. We have seen since 2000, we have seen a spike from approximately 17 million people in the SNAP program. We've seen that balloon to over 45, nearly 46 million people. So what does that mean financially? It means we're going from about $20 billion a year to in excess of $83 billion that we're spending on the food programs. What happened is in the stimulus bill, they ended up removing the work requirement in 2009. That is largely what caused this spike. And as Jim noted, look, you look back to the formation of this country. One of the reasons we are the superpower, we have such a great nation, is because we incentivized people to work. But we have gradually moved away from that and actually incentivizing people to not work. It's the wrong formula. It's not fair for the people who are stuck in this traffic circle of poverty, and it's not fair to the people who are paying for it. There are better ways out.
Great, thank you. And Congressman Smith, let's get this third piece on the table as well, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which a lot of people maybe don't even know exists, don't think of it necessarily as a welfare program, but it is, and you've been thinking about it a lot. Could you just acquaint us with what EITC is all about and what we should think about it?
Of course. Thank you for having us here. It's an honor to be on the stage with Jim and Garrett, two fine members of the House. First off, I just want to say welfare reform is very personal to me. I represent what by some people consider the 13th poorest congressional district out of 435 in the country. But it hits home in much more depth. You were talking about my family farm that's been in my family for 4 generations that I have now and that we run. But at that same family farm, who I purchased from my dad and his uncles, my grandparents, up until the time I was in law school, which wasn't that long ago, to come home at Christmas or Thanksgiving in order just to wash my hands at my grandparents' house. I had to go outside and pump water out of the cistern because they never had running water and died in 2001. So when you talk about poverty and not having a lot, I understand it. But my grandparents always taught us that you help yourself and that you can always do better. And if they would have lived to see that their grandson could possibly be a member of Congress, fighting for policies that would help other people to grow out of it, and the Earned Income Tax Credit is one of those that does. You look at the fraud in the system and the improper payments that was done just in the most recent survey, almost 24% of the payments were improper. Cost over $16.8 billion in improper payments. The bill that we're voting on today, in fact, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, we put a provision on in the Ways and Means Committee that would require work-eligible Social Security numbers to help beat the fraud. Some other issues that we need to put in there is to have more data to actually understand an employer and employee situation of really are they working and receiving it instead of just receiving the Earned Income Tax Credit. But there's a lot of work still yet to do there. But it is a welfare program that we can make some strong changes to, but we're starting today.
Great. So let's, there's some more elements of that I want to come back to, but let's stick with the issue of spending, because Congressman Jordan, you just briefly introduced the issue of we'd like to know how much we're spending on welfare, which many people may not recognize. We actually don't do that right now in our budgeting. Can you explain?
Yeah, just so one of the things we require in the legislation is give us the aggregate, give us the total. What are we spending on? We got all these social welfare spending programs in healthcare and education and job training, all these different silos and a bunch of programs in each of those areas. We need to know a total. It's probably no surprise to this audience, no surprise to Americans that we got a little waste and a little redundancy in the federal government. Imagine that. So we'd like to get a handle on some of that, particularly in welfare, and design programs that actually help people, treat taxpayers with respect, and never forget the other thing that's involved here. When I talk to employers across our district, the thing I hear constantly is we can't find enough people to work. And we have a focus on immigration with our president, and I think the proper focus on making sure we get control of the border. So the only way you're going to get the folks you need in the working is you're going to have to move people from non-work to work. You're just going to have to do it, particularly if you're going to grow at a rate big enough to have us be able to deal with a $20 trillion debt. If we're going to get to 4% growth and maintain it, we're going to need more people in the labor markets, basic labor supply economics. So there's all these reasons to do welfare. to save taxpayers money, to help us with the kind of economic growth we need, and most importantly, to help families who've been stuck in the system. And so let's get a handle on the overall spending, let's incentivize work, and let's make all that happen.
Excellent. Congressman Graves, you've been focused on SNAP, and can you give us a little more understanding of how work can be incentivized and for what part of the SNAP population we should be focusing on?
Sure. What we're seeing in the federal government today, and as Jim noted, you have a lot of different programs that unfortunately are run in stovepipes. And if there were better coordination or management, we would see complementary efforts yielding much better results. An example of that is right now, there's federal funding for job assistance programs. There's federal funding for job training programs. Yet there's no connectivity between those programs and the folks that are unemployed. And so the legislation simply helps to pull together those connections, connecting those that are in need of employment with the job assistance and the job training centers that are out there, and preparing them for the actual workforce or the jobs that are available today.
And the folks that your bill focuses on are able-bodied adults, right?
Able-bodied adults without dependents.
Okay.
So those that are truly capable of working, understanding that we can address that subset of the population and have the greatest effectiveness in terms of helping to transition into the workforce.
It's been so remarkable to watch when these kinds of work requirements, such as you have in your bill, are implemented. First of all, we saw it in '96 with the TANF, the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, a work requirement put on one of the dozens of federal means-tested welfare programs. The welfare rolls across the country dropped by about half. And there's some similarly impressive results on the food stamp work requirements at the state level. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So this isn't something that we just came up with and said, hey, let's try this. You can look at what's happened in Maine. You can look at what's happened in Kansas and in Alabama. They're great pilot programs that demonstrate the effectiveness of these efforts. In Alabama, they did a pilot program in 11 counties. And they ended up having a reduction of approximately 85%.
Wow.
85% of those that were stuck on these programs transitioning out. In Kansas, they had approximately 60% of the folks went into the workforce after simply linking up and requiring the connectivity between the job assistance and job training centers. And in Maine, if you extrapolate the success in Maine with a few other reforms that I believe are low-hanging fruit items, we believe that you could demonstrate $8 to $9 billion in annual cost savings. Let me say that again, $8 to $9 billion in annual cost savings. Extraordinary savings. And more importantly, transitioning these people into the workforce. There's this belief that poverty, or it's not that there's a belief, there's evidence that poverty is a traffic circle without exits, that it's inherited from generation to generation. With the amount of dollars we're spending, the programs we're spending, that is absurd. That's unacceptable to have that type of inefficiency. So these efforts, complemented with the ones from Jim and Jason, this begins providing a pathway to prosperity, helping to break that continual inherited cycle of poverty and giving folks equal opportunity.
When you require a work component for someone to receive the benefit, they will forego the benefit and just go get a job. Imagine that, right? That's exactly what you want, or go get a second. That's exactly what you want to incentivize. That's what's happened in the states that Garrett talked about.
The results that you're talking about are just stunning. You can get 80%, help 80% of this category of recipient onto work. Why would we not do that? You know, for their dignity, for the good of the community, and so on. It's just remarkable.
Well, looking at the success from '96 and to see us do the backsliding that President Obama pushed in 2009, it doesn't make sense to pull it away. And I'll say it again, it's not fair to the people that are impoverished, and it's not fair to those that are paying.
That's right. Congressman Smith, let me come back to you because there's another important component of what the EITC reforms you've been thinking about, in that we've talked for a long time about marriage penalties in the welfare state and that we're discouraging this most fundamental institution.
Are you asking that question because I'm the only one not married on this panel? I mean, thank you, but...
How do we get rid of marriage penalties in the welfare state? How could we do that in EITC?
You know, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the tax code in general, has a lot of areas that have the marriage penalty, which is wrong, and we're trying to fix that. But in EITC, you see naturally people are rewarded to live together and never be married, because once they marry and they have the joint earnings, they're disqualified. And so we have to find a way that puts people on the same level playing field and where it doesn't make the tax code incentivize people to be divorced and continue to do it. Another aspect is just to require when someone has sole custody, sole legal custody of the child, is that they're the only ones that can get the EITC. Those are several different provisions. I would like to touch on, if I could, the work requirement that they were mentioning earlier. I said our congressional district is like the 13th poorest, but the work requirement proves that it's so important because in 20 of my 30 counties that's in our district, more than 50% of adults do not work. In 21 of my 30 counties, the poverty level's over 20%. So there is a huge correlation right there of not working and being impoverished. The best way out of poverty is a job, and that is the best way to move forward, especially with able-bodied, healthy adults. It's key to the outcome. I mean, we've studied in the Ways and Means Committee what we consider the poverty trap, where you look at a single mother who has 2 kids that in order for her to have a better quality of life than full dependence on the 80 different federal programs, welfare programs, and all the different state programs that are accessible, she needs to make over $60,000 a year. The average income in Southeast Missouri is $36,000 a year. So our current structure incentivizes people to stay on complete dependence on all the various welfare programs than to actually go out and try to better themselves. And that is a huge impact of how we can transform policy, is to eliminate that poverty trap where people can work themselves off. We've had people testify in our committee to say, I would have been better in my quality of life if I would have turned down a pay raise from $12 to $13 an hour because I would lose my child care subsidies or I'll lose these various programs. We got to address that.
Yeah. So the significance of work in marriage as antidotes to poverty is kind of a theme across these proposals. And what's remarkable is that both of those are so important to our flourishing as human beings. Mm-hmm. They're all about the dignity of the human person and those who in need who we want to help. Americans are a generous people. We want to help our neighbors in need. How can we do that in a way that uplifts these aspects of human dignity? And it's intriguing to me that the byproducts of these things are the kinds of goals that we set all the time as policymakers. These also reap savings. They also bring about sound budgeting. They also bring about stable communities and so on. And so this welfare reform integration, which perhaps we have not focused on enough as conservatives, is very critical to other goals that we have long held dear as conservatives. What's intriguing about the EITC marriage penalty elimination is that we've talked forever about marriage penalties in the welfare state, but this is the first proposal that would actually do something about it. And we need to get busy doing that. We've had 50 years of this experiment. It's not going well. We've seen unwed childbearing skyrocket during that time. So the kinds of work and marriage reforms that you're talking about there, the marriage penalty reform, is critically important.
Don't get a job, don't get married, have more kids, we'll give you more money. You cannot design a worse system. Yeah. So you have to incentivize marriage, you have to incentivize family, you have to incentivize work. It helps everyone.
Yeah, great. Well, we got a lot of smart people in this audience as well, and I'd like to open it up for 6-8 minutes of questions with you. We have microphones coming around. If you wouldn't mind raising your hand and identifying yourself when the microphone gets to you. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
How do you pull this off politically without seeming anti-poor?
Look, this whole debate needs to be redefined. I mentioned this earlier. Look, this isn't fair to the folks that are impoverished. You can look at the statistics. You inherit poverty. If you grow up on these welfare programs, you inherit poverty. And there is a much greater chance that your generation is going to be stuck in that, and the next generation is going to be stuck in that. So we've got to redefine this and make it clear that the nearly 100 different programs, the $1 trillion we're spending, subsidizing healthcare and education and transportation and cell phones and energy and food and housing, everything, it is not yielding the outcome that is beneficial to those impoverished. And similarly, it is not fair, as I mentioned, to those that are paying for it. So I think this is a ripe opportunity for us to redefine this, to make it clear that those that are impoverished right now and dependent upon these programs are not being given that exit ramp, that pathway to prosperity. And that's what we're trying to change the dynamics to allow for that to happen, to actually give them that pathway to prosperity, building upon the success that we've seen in other states and other pilot programs.
Well said. All right, let's take one more here and then come over here.
Gerard Robinson with the American Enterprise Institute. Is there any way to add entrepreneurship, the teaching of it, the values of it into what you're talking about, assuming a ton of jobs all of a sudden aren't going to create the way they used to?
I'll just quickly make mention that while the connectivity between the job assistance and job training programs, I think, and Jim mentioned the stovepipe, I think there is, but I also want to be clear, I think we can help to modernize these programs to reflect today's economy, today's opportunities. And so I do think that should be a complementary part of this as we move forward, and maybe it's a step two, that we come in and help to modernize some of those efforts, again, to help incorporate entrepreneurship and the future economy into these. Because it is amazing what you can do with today's technology where you can leapfrog into extraordinary business opportunities with some of the entrepreneurship and innovation that we've seen lately.
I think also we're going to have an education panel a little later in the day, and this is one reason we wanted to integrate our education reform ideas into this anti-poverty event, is because you've got to think about that. What's the certification process? How do we reduce barriers to entry so people can get and start jobs and get licensed in things in the ways they can't right now? Yes?
Peter Ferrara, Heartland Institute. I worked in the Reagan administration for Reagan's chief welfare policy advisor, Bob Carlson. And the 1996 Welfare Reform Act was based on block grants to the states, which was an idea pioneered by Reagan and Carlson. And it was ended up being designed just as they wanted, even though it was well after Reagan left office. Are there any plans for further block grants? There are actually over 100 means-tested federal welfare programs. Yep. We're spending $1 trillion a year on them. And so all of them, any one of them could be block granted as well. We had this enormous success in 1996. We should be doing even more of that.
No, I agree. I'm all for block grants. Back to the political question. People like the idea of letting the states run this and giving the money back to the states. That makes sense. And the idea that you require work to get a benefit, that's like an 80% issue. I mean, think about what happened in this last election. There were all kinds of folks in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin who made a guy president that no one thought could be president. And part of what they did was, I believe this just as sure as I'm sitting here, is I call them second grade teachers and second shift workers. There's a guy who works second shift who walks out to get in his truck to drive to work, and as he's getting in his truck, I always say, now remember, when you work second shift, you miss half your kids' little league games, you miss after school activities, but he's working hard for his family. As he's getting in his truck to drive to work, there's a guy 2 houses down, sitting on the front porch, reading the paper, drinking coffee, and the second shift worker knows the front porch sitter can work and won't work and getting his money. And he's driving to work and the news is on, they're talking about the federal government screwing up this program, screwing up that program. Guess what? That guy's ticked off, right? When he's driving to work, there's a lady driving home from work who teaches second grade at the local school. And she's busted her tail all day long helping her kids. And she's driving home, she's listening to the same radio station where some reporter's talking about the federal government screwing up at this program, doing all kinds of ridiculous things. She drives home, pulls into her driveway on the same street, sees the same guy sitting on the front porch drinking coffee, reading the paper. She knows he can work and won't work, and she's paying him. And she's ticked off too. And I would tell you what happened on election day was second shift workers and second grade teachers, particularly in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, said, we're making Donald Trump president. And we don't care what everyone says. They're fed up with it. So Garrett is exactly right. This is a fairness issue. We need to focus on the people stuck in the system. And I agree completely, helping them get to a better position in life. But we cannot forget the impact that it'll have on our economy when they move into the workforce. And more importantly, we can't forget the fairness aspect of this. People who are paying people who can work and won't work, that should not happen. So that is how we sell this, and that's the political 80-some%. They are tired of it, and they want this to happen. And we've talked with the president about this. He gets it. He wants it to happen, and that's why I'm excited about some of this stuff getting done next year.
Jim said it exactly of what my district is. I've said my district is one of the poorest. It's home of Rush Limbaugh, so it's a very conservative congressional district. But what's interesting is in 4 years, out of all 435 congressional districts in the country, ours had the largest net swing from Romney beating Obama to Trump beating Hillary by more than 20 points. It was the third highest of 435 in southeast Missouri.
Yep.
And it's because of that. People are fed up. They're angry because they're working the second shift and watching so many other people sitting there and getting all the enjoyments of life when they could have a job, because in 20 of my 30 counties, more than half of the adults are not working. And when you're talking about the communication aspect, I think that's super important. I mean, think about this. In the last 53 years, we've spent over $25 trillion on poverty programs. And in 1964, whenever we started the war on poverty, we had 36 million people that were impoverished. Today we have over 40 million people. And we have spent $25 million, if you want to talk about numbers. And we spend $1 trillion a year on 80+ different federal programs. We got to get people to work in. And we got to make sure that they're incentivized to work. You talk about the entrepreneurship side. The best entrepreneurship side is allowing people to grow and to have the fulfillment of a better quality of life by working themselves off the system. The way that we have it set up right now, we work people to stay to this amount to maximize the least amount of work with the most amount of benefits. But if they hit that little curve, then they lose everything. And so we got to change it all.
I can add one other thing. In our bill, if states don't comply with this, they begin having to put skin in the game. Look, block grants are great, but we've got to make sure we're incentivizing the states to achieve the milestones, the outcomes, the improvements that we're all seeking. If you're just going to, like under Obamacare, if you're just going to give 100% federal funds to programs like expansion of Medicaid, you're not going to yield the outcomes for truly getting better health care, getting people off government dependency. You've got to make sure you incentivize the states to achieve these improvements as well. I think it's an important part, and that's why we added the cost share for states if they're not complying with the work mandate.
That's absolutely essential. Taxing at one level of government and handing it over to bureaucrats at another level of government is not a conservative idea unless we very carefully fix those objectives as you've articulated it. Melissa, let's go to you for the last question here.
Hi, Melissa Ortiz, the Administration on Community Living at HHS. And there are two things I want to throw out to you. First of all, I would love to see you guys shift the dialogue to work capable instead of able-bodied, because 85% of the people with physical or intellectual and physical or intellectual and developmental disabilities are work capable but are on disability benefits because of the way the system is structured. It is like death to get off of them. You can only work a certain amount per month, and if you go over that, your benefit for the next month is immediately canceled, and you have to go through the process of trying to make sure that the next month after that, you're going to get back on. Here's the thing. I know that employers are looking for employees. If we will remove the barriers to putting people with disabilities to work, we can put people in jobs, we can grow this economy, and we can take down the number 2 killer of our budget. And I would just love to see you guys shift the discussion to work capable away from able-bodied. Because when someone with a disability who is capable of working hears that, they think, gee, they must not care about me and what I bring to the table. Yeah. So I just want to admonish you guys and encourage you guys to shift the discussion.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Any closing remarks before we round up? And thank you.
I just want to say, with the crowd here, I think this is a great opportunity for Jason to give us Match.com screen name. And if we can get these poverty programs working, Jim can buy the coat that goes with the suit. I mean, I think this is a great...
We have such great members of Congress.
This team is ready to go to legislate on welfare reform next year. Give them a hand. But what you've just heard is the outlines of a major welfare reform agenda, beginning with, first, aggregating the costs of what is currently being spent on 80 different federal means-tested programs that provide cash, food, housing, social services, and medical assistance to poor and low-income Americans. So we have more than 80 federal means-tested programs that are doing that right now. We spend more than $1 trillion per year on these 80 programs. And we have cumulatively, during the 50 years of the war on poverty, spent more than $22 trillion on this agenda. And yet, we are seeing so little reform. So What Congressman Jordan's bill would do is, first of all, to account for that cost. And part of the significance of that is that it will begin to help the conversation in America shift from the merely material needs that I began with today and think about holistic flourishing and what that would look like. And of course, that has to begin with the understanding that our relational flourishing is central to that idea. This panel that we're about to move to is going to focus more on those ideas about the relationship between family and community and basic life in terms of flourishing economically and materially as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of introduction here of who we'll be joined by. We will be joined by Paul Winfrey, who's the Deputy Director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. He previously worked on Capitol Hill on the Senate Budget Committee staff, and he's no stranger to Heritage. He has served 2 tours of duty here at Heritage on our economic team. In all of these roles, he has worked extensively on budget, tax, health, and welfare policy. Scott Winship directs the Social Capital Project of the Joint Economic Committee on Capitol Hill. He was tapped for that role by Senator Mike Lee, who recognized in Scott's work at the Manhattan Institute and other think tanks an appreciation for the relationship between family and community and economic opportunity. And Scott's also been a contributor at Forbes. Marie Fishpaw is my colleague here at the Heritage Foundation. She directs our work on healthcare and welfare. She served as the deputy assistant to Vice President Dick Cheney in the White House during the Bush administration. She's also worked on Capitol Hill on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and she most recently served on Bloomberg government directing multiple product teams there. We're delighted to have her join us earlier this year to direct our healthcare and welfare. And Robert Rector, well known to many here, is a senior research fellow specializing in welfare issues. He was an architect of the 1996 welfare reform that we've referred to here today, and he's one of the nation's leading experts on poverty. So I'm going to join them here, and we're going to have a conversation as we did before. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you here with us.
Thanks for having us.
So in case you're wondering, Scott Winship is on the end. Paul Winfrey is next to him. Robert Rector, Marie Fishpaw. I would like to begin, Paul, with you.
Oh, boy.
No pressure.
No pressure, seriously.
You're coming to us from the White House today. And it would be really interesting to get your perspective, as there's been a little more hum about welfare reform being a legislative priority for the new year, 2018. What's the White House perspective on that? What are the kinds of themes and principles and priorities that you feel like are important from that?
Sure. So, first of all, it's really great to be back here at Heritage. It feels quite like home. As you mentioned, I've been here for the 7 years of my professional career at Heritage, over 2 different tours of duty. So it's kind of nice to be back in the Allison Auditorium. Taking a step back, welfare reform is something that is very important to the president. It's something that excites him. It's something that he has a lot of energy about. We have gone in there several times to talk to him about things that have absolutely nothing to do with welfare reform. And as the president has been known to do, he completely changes the topic and says that he wants to instead talk about welfare reform in some capacity. And so we met with him a couple of months ago. And he gave Andrew Bremberg, who's the director of the Domestic Policy Council, and I the directive to essentially start working on a major welfare reform proposal and to begin with thinking about like what the administration can do unilaterally, and then how we can essentially engage our allies in Congress to get some major legislative accomplishments done within his first term on welfare reform. And we began, again, by basically taking a step back, and the president likes to take a lot of initiatives either himself, or he likes his agency officials, his secretaries, to take initiatives themselves. And so we have drafted an executive order on welfare reform that essentially does 2 different things. The first thing that it does is it sets out a series of principles for welfare reform that we would like to essentially be a message to Capitol Hill in the direction that we want to take. And a lot of those principles will not look all that dissimilar to what a lot of folks in this room have been working on for a long time. So we want to empower people. We want to learn from the states. We want to learn from local communities. And one of the messages that I've been driving to essentially our staff and our agencies on welfare reform and the direction that we're taking is this message that it's people that help people. It's not governments that help people. And so how do we learn from people who are actually in the communities, actually helping people, and then ultimately empower them by either getting out of the way or redirecting the resources in their direction to essentially reward successes without essentially a unilateral approach, or without necessarily just kicking it to the states and transitioning what is essentially a federal role into a state role, which is something that Jennifer addressed on the last panel. The second half of the executive order, which is yet to be signed, essentially directs the agencies to take a look at the principles and then figure out what they can do on their own to start meeting some of the objectives that are laid out there through changes in regulation and guidance, and then to ultimately submit those recommendations to the president for an evaluation, and then we can start essentially effectuating them, promulgating regs and so on and so forth. The president really wants to lead on this. He has delivered that message loud and clear to us. We've opened up conversations with leadership in Congress to let them know that that is the direction that we are heading, and that we would like to all do this together. Like I said, I mean, we're super excited about it. We're devoting a lot of resources to this, and yeah.
Great, wonderful. Well, thanks for giving us such a broad view of it, and we're going to come back to that, I'm sure, during this panel and in the conversation to follow. First, let me get Scott. The Social Capital Project, the Joint Economic Committee might not be familiar to people. Can you just kind of articulate what it is and give us context about why it matters for this welfare reform conversation that we're having?
Sure, absolutely. And I also want to say it's a pleasure to be here in front of everybody. One of my tweets got retweeted this morning on the distribution of taxation in the U.S. by one of my favorite bands. So as far as I'm concerned, my day is peaked. And I'm just phoning it in at this point.
I'm offended, man.
Arcade Fire. Crazy. Anyhow, so the Joint Economic Committee, for those of you who don't know, was actually created in the same legislation that the Council of Economic Advisors was created in. It's sort of a think tank within Congress. It's bipartisan, obviously, but it's also bicameral. Has members from the House and the Senate. The chairmanship switches every 2 years between the House and the Senate, and the vice chairmanship does as well. And so Senator Lee became the vice chair in January, and decided what he wanted to do with his time on the JEC was to shine a light on issues of social capital in our associational life. Not so much to develop a policy agenda. For those of you that know Senator Lee and his staff, they've spent a lot of time developing very smart proposals on healthcare, welfare reform, any number of issues. He's not looking to sort of develop a new policy agenda at this point around social capital. Really what he wants to do is just shine a light on these issues, get other members and other congressional staff talking about these issues, getting other policymakers talking about them, so that we can all be thinking more about ways that we can address the breakdown of social capital and the ways that it might be better to aim policies there rather than at economic solutions. I think, and this is where my past research is completely aligned with Senator Lee's. So many times we tend to think our economics are doing worse than they are. The poverty rate actually is lower than it's ever been if you measure poverty the right way. We've made incredible progress there. The labor market appears to be as strong as it's ever been. A lot of men have dropped out of the labor force, but it turns out most of them actually don't want to work. They say in the current population survey that they don't want a job. So there's this misunderstanding about technological unemployment and the labor market breaking down and poverty being on the rise, where people go to economics sort of instantly. And I think the senator believes, as I do, that that's probably the wrong place to go if you're concerned about reducing the poverty rate further, if you're concerned about increasing upward mobility from the bottom. And so we're taking a look very broadly defined. It's social capital. It's one of these terms that means different things to everybody. But broadly looking at the health of families, communities, religious congregations, workplace, associational life, things like residential patterns and segregation, and are we increasingly isolated from people who aren't like us, and how does that affect our national politics? So really wide umbrella, but certainly especially around family and community, we think that has real strong implications for welfare reform. Just because if families are breaking down, obviously that's going to reduce upward mobility from the bottom. If communities are breaking down, they're going to have less capacity to do the sorts of things that Paul was talking about, to the extent that we all decide, well, this is the federal government's job. The federal government probably isn't as effective as local institutions when they're robust and they've flexed their muscles on these sorts of issues over time. So we think it'll be very relevant to the debate next year.
Absolutely, and just the frame that you're creating to help us integrate between the silos that we usually operate in. We have strictly social policy or strictly economic policy. You're reteaching a way of integrated thinking and integrated inquiry into these challenges, which is singing Robert Rector's tune. And I want to toss to him to talk a little bit more about what he's gleaned from several decades of looking at poverty in America and how to think about what's gone wrong with the welfare state to date and how we can redirect it to be more effective.
The reason the welfare state and the war on poverty has failed is that we have completely the wrong goal. And until you have the proper goal, you're going to continue to spend money and fail. The goal of the war on poverty and the goal of the welfare state is simply to artificially boost people's incomes through welfare transfers, and to basically, when you get into it, is to redistribute income, is what they really want to do. They want to equalize income. But in fact, what the goal needs to be is to improve the quality of life of low-income people. And to do that, what you have to do is improve their psychological well-being and the social conditions that they live in. And the simplest way to understand this is to think back to your grandparents in the 1920s. In the 1920s, probably 70% of the US population was poor by today's standards, literally poor, because there's no welfare there to back them up. Today, if you measured with welfare added, it's closer to 5%. If you go back to the time of the Korean War, 35% of the population is legitimately poor at that point. But we actually don't think about them as poor because they lived in stable families, because each generation did better educationally than their forebears did, because they had strong work ethics, because they had levels of conscientiousness that allowed them to have large levels of self-control in their lives. And the fact that their income standards were low really didn't affect their kids' ability to rise up. If you really thought the way the left believes that, oh, if you have a low income level, then you and your kids are doomed to failure. Well, think about that. Think about the 1930s, okay? Everybody was poor in the 1930s. I mean, it's close to 80% poverty now. And what were those kids? That was the greatest generation. That's right. They won World War II. They won the Cold War. Nothing we've done, I'm a baby boomer, ugh, you know, nothing we've done is even close to them. They didn't commit crime, okay? They had self-control, they had foreplanning, they had personalities and character, in part because society educated their character, because society believed that character was actually more important than, say, IQ or something like that, which is so absolutely true. So what we need to do is have a welfare state that's focused on the well-being of low-income people. And there are three components to that. The first is strong, positive personal relationships with others, which primarily means healthy marriage. Now, if you look what we've done on marriage, we've basically wiped marriage out in low-income communities. Good job, okay? So we just wiped out one of the principal elements of human happiness. We trampled it, okay? The second one is a capacity to control your environment, to affect your environment in a positive way. It's called competence or competency. And that in a society is largely experienced through work. Okay, so we have a welfare system that gives people stuff without working. Okay, and we've substantially eroded the work ethic, primarily among males, where it's the most important to them. We've destroyed that. And then the third element of happiness is a connectedness to something that's larger than yourself. A service to things that are larger than you, that you feel you participate in. And the secular welfare state has essentially divorced people from churches and from institutions that provide that sense of connectedness, and it provides social marginalization. So when you actually look at low-income communities, they have lower levels of connectedness than anybody else, and lower levels of connectedness to value-generating institutions, primarily churches that help people achieve human well-being. A young male in the inner city who goes to church is 30 to 50% less likely to be involved in juvenile crime than is one that does not. Look at that. Could you find any government program that does anything remotely like that? But we consistently push the church to the side and not have any effect. What do you need to do? What you need to do is really three things here. The first is establish fairness in the welfare system so that able-bodied people in any program who get assistance should be required to work or at least look for work as a condition for getting aid. About 80% of the American public agrees with that, which is why the Republican Party has ignored this issue for 20 years. The second thing you need to do is remove all those marriage penalties that are, every single welfare program has a marriage penalty in it. What we say to low-income couples is, do not put a ring on her finger. If you do, we're going to take $8,000 or $10,000 away from you. Good luck. It's a terrible, terrible thing to do. And the third thing to do is about 1/10 of all the welfare spending is focused on programs that are designed explicitly to change behavior, to alter things, say an anti-recidivism program in crime, or a drug rehabilitation program, something like that, or a daycare type of program. None of these programs work. We actually, if you're in this field, we have Rossi's law. It's a social science law. It says none of these programs work, okay? They don't work. And so therefore what we should do is continue to do more of that. We could do evidence-based policy, which is exactly the same thing we've done for the last 40 years. We don't need to do that. What we need to do is pay these programs on the basis of outcomes. Simplest example, if you have a program that's designed to get people off of drugs, you pay them only if they get off of drugs. If you have a clean urine test, we pay you. If you don't get anything. This is what we could call marketizing social services, okay? You don't pay the private sector for theoretically proposing to produce cars. They have to actually produce cars. In this case, let's pay for outcomes. Let's pay in an anti-crime program, anti-juvenile delinquency program, pay for non-arrests. If you have these people in the program and you have a reduction in the number of kids who get arrested, we give you money. Otherwise, we don't give you money. And in fact, there are thousands and thousands of programs across the country, some of which do work, contrary to Rossi's law, but we don't know what they are. And there's actually no way to discover them, and there's no way to move money into them because the bureaucracies are incredibly rigid, even if you knew that they were successful. A marketized system based on outcomes where the money follows the outcome moves the money automatically from failure to success. It's just the same as the group that has the better computer, the money moves to them because it moves automatically through the market. You can marketize all these social services and you can produce real effects. Things like, look, everybody here probably knows that a poor mother speaks to her baby children 1/3 as much as an upper middle class mother. It's a terrible, terrible thing. The only people that don't know that are the poor mothers. We never tell them about that. All middle class mothers know all about this, right? So just put up together a program where you pay people for actually communicating that information so that at least the people that are affected by that actually know this simple social fact. And continue to move in that direction. And by doing that, instead of focusing on how much additional benefits we can give somebody, we will actually begin to deal with the real problems, which I call behavioral poverty, which cause the well-being of the poor to be so negative.
I want to come back to that idea of holistic well-being and bring in the others on the panel on that topic. But Marie, I do want to bring in the healthcare issue because it has so much to do with fighting poverty in America. And you've been thinking about it a lot in the midst of the healthcare debate this fall. So we need to shift our perspective on some of this. Can you help us do that?
Sure. So Robert was mentioning that one of the things that really matters in feeling of happiness and control in your life is having control over significant decisions and being able to affect change in things that matter to you. And when we look at the welfare state, roughly 60% of spending is going on medical care for poor or low-income people. And the people who are in this program do not have the ability to choose the care that's right for them. These choices are made for them because a government bureaucrat running Medicaid, running CHIP, or any of our number of programs makes the call which plan these people should be on. And so when you ask yourself, what are we getting for this spending? And it's an enormous amount of spending. We're seeing a lot of substandard results. So typically, people enrolled in programs for medical care for the poor or low income are they're in some sort of plan where it's not a private insurance plan that somebody else could normally access. It's a plan where you're getting less access to the doctors that you want to see and substandard quality of outcomes, so the kind of health outcome you see. So what does this actually mean to not have the choice of what plan you want to pick? It means that if you are doing the right thing and you lose your job and your job goes away, most likely some government official is going to put you on Medicaid, and you're not going to be able to have the choice to use the money that we're spending for a program that you think makes sense for you. If you're a parent, I wrote this down because I wanted to make sure I got it right. So 36 million children in our nation are enrolled in Medicaid or CHIP, which is more than the total population of America's largest 15 largest cities combined. And not a single parent or guardian whose kids are on these programs gets to say that I get to use these dollars to put a kid, my child, who I'm responsible for, on a plan that matters to me. So when we think about where should we go when we're talking about reforming programs that provide subsidies, we're definitely looking at the role of choice. We think that every individual who qualifies for a plan is in a place to make this choice, should have the ability to make that choice. And if you're a parent or a guardian, you should be able to make those choices for your children. So we've been taking a deep dive into these questions and have really focused on the importance of them in lending towards one of the goals that Robert's talked about, which is increasing the agency that people who are on subsidized care have.
So Scott and Paul, I'd like to come back to you and get your reflections on that idea of increasing the agency in which I began today by talking about human dignity as central to our goals on welfare reform. And that really has to mean, at a minimum, increasing the agency of recipients and helping them achieve their aspirations and dreams. In the Social Capital Project, you've talked about associational life, which is a fancy word for talking about our relational context that we're in everywhere we turn, or maybe not. Maybe it's frayed around us. And so we've noted in our political discourse, especially over the last year, J.D. Vance has particularly highlighted these things that we're feeling just a void in so much of that. So I'd be interested if, Scott, first you could comment on what you're seeing on the research about the fraying of that and the possibility of restoring, and what that has to do with these policy themes that have come out in Robert and Marie's comments.
Yeah, let's see. So the first part of the question, I think, is pretty easy. We put out a report. The first report we put out, I think, was in May, and we looked at as many trends as we could find in associational life dating back to the early 1970s. And there are some positive things that have happened, or at least there's an absence of negative things. So voluntarism doesn't appear to have declined over time. In fact, if you look at Gallup data, it's actually increased over time. So we spend as much time together with our families in terms of time use studies as we always have. We don't live any farther away from our parents than we used to. But aside from a sprinkling of things here and there, most things have gotten worse. It stands out especially in terms of family structure, where out-of-wedlock births in particular have just shot through the roof. We're working on a paper, Heritage alum Rachel Sheffield has been working on it for a few months now, where we're looking at the decline in shotgun marriage. Divorce rose and then flattened out, but it would have kept increasing if not for the fact that the boomers got through their peak divorce years. If you look at religious adherence, that's declined over time pretty dramatically. If you look at the time that people spend outside of work with their coworkers, that's dropped. So most of the indicators that we looked at have gotten worse over time. Voting rates, for sure, have gone down. And I think where this all relates to agency is just that we're shaped almost entirely by, on the one hand, our genes, and on the other hand, our social experiences, what we learn from the people around us. And if all of those communities, and if you can consider the family as being kind of the most immediate community, have frayed, then it's just going to be difficult to continue to transmit across generations the values, the ways of living, the motivations, the skills required to interact with other people than it was in the past. And we think that comes out in all sorts of weird ways. There's a great essay by Mary Eberstadt, I think it's on the cover of Commentary magazine now, or the previous one, where she argues that that identity politics, specifically sort of this really strong and angry identity politics that we are seeing on college campuses, oftentimes around ethnicity, sexual orientation, that a lot of that comes from the withering of the family, that sort of you don't have family that is part of your identity, that you find it elsewhere. And I think you could generalize more broadly to the decline of community. We don't think of ourselves necessarily as being part of a community, a neighborhood in the way that we once did. And I think you can also generalize to other kinds of identity. Is it the case that maybe the polarization that we're seeing across the country between left and right has gotten worse because we're all searching for some sort of thing to latch onto and define ourselves by, and if it's not family and community, it turns into, well, I guess I'm a liberal, I guess I'm a conservative, and that gets those fights get more and more bitter. So we're still exploring that, but I think the breakdown of social capital really does come out in all sorts of subtle ways.
Yeah. Paul, let me ask you to comment on that. It's obviously not a strictly policy question, but you're working for an administration that very much connected with people's sense of lack of opportunity, lack of mobility, and just be interested in your reflections on that.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of, mic on? A couple of things. To come back to something that Robert mentioned earlier, one of the major shortfalls of neoclassical economics and welfare economics in the 20th century was the concept that the government can create income, but by the creation of income through policy changes, you also create some losers. And the way that you essentially deal with the losers is that you redistribute from the winners to the losers, and that's it. Everybody's better off. One of the things that both Robert has devoted his career to, and Scott his as well, is the exploration of all of the other stuff that matters a whole lot that is totally left out of that equation, and that's ultimately what we're talking about here today. I actually think that there's both a policy bit of this and obviously a politics bit of this, and it gets outside of the welfare space, as Scott was essentially mentioning. I mean, all of the statistics that you mentioned. I mean, this is a larger societal issue. One of the I'm an economist by training, and so I think about things generally the way that economists do. And one of the concepts that was important to Adam Smith, father of modern economics, was this concept of discussion amongst equals. And in order to have discussion, you need several essentially predicates to that. First, you need language. You need the ability to talk to each other and express your views. And then secondly, you need both the ability to persuade through language, but also the openness to persuasion. And for Smith, the openness to persuasion was essentially based on sympathy. And in order to have sympathy for others, you had to have constant interactions with people. And one of the things that I think that we see both in the political sphere, but really across the board, that has essentially a derivative of a lot of these breakdowns in social communities and in social indicators, is just this breakdown in the tenements to discussion and essentially the ability to sympathize one another. And essentially what we end up doing is running off to our own positions and planting flags and drawing battle lines. J.S. Mill picked up on this about 70 years after Smith and essentially said that without these tenements, without the ability to sympathize, we can't have society and we can't have self-government. And that's why this is so important, right? This is absolutely critical, and not just a discussion about welfare policy, but in everything we do, from tax policy to what we're doing inside of our communities. That said, one of the concepts and principles that we've been trying to advance within the administration in regards to welfare reform that gets at what these gentlemen have talked about is this concept of trust. And you've got to have a level of not just respect for one another, but essentially trust of the beneficiaries themselves, a trust that people generally will make good decisions for themselves if they have the information that they need to make those decisions. And again, that comes back to how do we make sure that that is essentially in place? Well, the federal government, quite frankly, is just, if my last 11 months have taught me anything, it's just we're not very good at that. We just don't think about things in those terms. We think about how we interact with our sort of immediate actors, right? How do we transfer money from one entity to another? How quickly do we do it? How do we drop payment error? How do we essentially manipulate things that we have direct control over? What we're not very good at doing is thinking about what is going on the ground and how do these sort of social interactions essentially work, which again brings us back to how do then we empower people, right? How do we empower the local institutions? How do we empower actual individuals on the ground and not do things that are ultimately going to damage those social interactions from forming in the first place? And that is it's not just a holistic approach that we're using to inform. I mean, we've had lots of debates internally about whether or not to use this sort of lens in just the welfare space or to expand it beyond the welfare space, because it touches essentially everything that we end up doing. I think that you're right. The president won in part because of his ability to connect with individuals, but it's not just about the connection with individuals once every 4 years. It's about the constant connection with individuals. It's about this constant feedback about what's going on in Washington, and then also what's going on in the local communities. And we, as a federal government that employs more than 2 million people and has a bunch of different cabinet agencies and sends out over $700 billion a year in means-tested payments and does all of this stuff, all intended to help, we just need to do a much better job at running that connection, running that line of connection. And that is, I think, ultimately going to take a holistic, potentially redesign of the current system.
So it's a refreshingly integrated and holistic perspective coming from the White House and Capitol Hill, wouldn't you say? And that's exactly why we invited you. We want to open it up now to folks in the audience to be able to interact with you as well. If you'll raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, they're in the back. Please identify yourself.
My name is Yaya Fanusi with the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. I am a Trump Republican, not a Republican Party Republican. I have here for you my own the IFNC's Poverty Exit Platform. I just wrote it as I was listening to you. I'm going to give it to you.
Awesome.
And you hand it to the president and give Omarosa a copy. And just describe who I am.
I will do so.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Scott's a Trump Republican, too. That's why.
Others? Well. Yes. Kim.
Kim Borchers with FGA. And I just recently left the administration of Governor Sam Brownback, and I love to see all the great things Kansas has been touted for. But we do see a lot of folks right now trying to attribute the increase in foster care in our state to our welfare rolls tightening those things up and having those new restrictions. And so I'd be interested to see if you guys have any ways you're going to look at that to help other governors who are wanting to do real reforms, because I think most of the reasons why we have an increase in foster care is because the drug addiction rates are increasing, and so it's impacting and bringing those kids into the system. So I didn't know if you guys had any thoughts on that.
I mean, in welfare, we often talk about the growth of single-parent families, and the reason that we have child poverty today, for example, is due to the fact that the percentage of children that were being raised by single parents rose from about 10% to about 35% since the beginning of the war on poverty. But the step beyond that is what I call zero-parent families. So that there are 2 to 3% of children that have neither parent, and that's like you've lost them both. Okay, that's the next stage beyond single parenthood, and then foster care is a little subcomponent of this zero-parent continuum. So the overall question there is, you have to go back to the beginning where the thing started to fall apart, which is that the child probably didn't ever have a father, and then the mom's on drugs, and now the grandma has it, but the grandma isn't able, and so now you're in foster care. That's what that is. And the solution to that is to back way back up to the point before the conception occurred, because there were a mom and dad there. It's very surprising. And most of our stereotypes about them are not correct, and they're not hostile to marriage, particularly the mothers, but they don't actually have the understanding. Typically, mothers that have children without being married are not hostile to marriage, but they think they're going to find the right guy after the child is born. Well, that's a pretty disastrous life plan, and that life plan carried on through a number of sequences, a series of boyfriends that are likely to abuse the child and so forth, moving through the household, is probably the major cause of all of the problems that we're talking about here today. We have to back that up and maybe just start by telling her the truth and helping her develop a little bit better life plan. Also, the guys, if you talk to them, they'll always say, I absolutely am not going to do to my kids what my dad did to me, and then they do the exact same thing. So we need to educate them as well. The bottom line is that foster care exists because marriage has collapsed. Foster care, on the other hand, hasn't really grown that much, but we need to, and it certainly didn't grow because of welfare reform. If a mother, for example, one of the things we've had in welfare reform was the idea that if you required the mothers on AFTC to work, that a lot of them would simply choose not to, and the family would fall into destitution. That almost never happened. It's the most disparaging way that the left thinks about poor people. And most of the mothers responded positively. Those that didn't probably had a drug problem, and the reform probably fleshed that drug problem out, which is also a good thing, because being raised by a drug-abusing parent is not a good situation.
Next question. Yeah, Stanley.
Stanley Carlson Teese, Institutional Religious Freedom Alliance, and I was with the Bush White House faith-based office, and made a lot of mistakes, and it had its travails through the next administration. But actually, there are centers for faith-based and community initiatives in these major departments, and that's a point of contact with people on the ground. And I'm not sure that they're being utilized the way they could be as a place to listen, look at innovations, find things that work, to find ways to resource them. So I'd recommend some thinking about that. And I'm not sure that any of those directors are at this meeting, and they ought to be.
Yeah, point. Thank you. Yes, Josh.
Josh Shepard with The Stream. There were some stats presented about the religious participation and how that is linked to better outcomes. I'm curious in terms of government policies, if you see that this is about potentially removing barriers that have been created with religious institutions, or is there some other role that the government plays just because it was in this context of government policy?
So we've started looking into this a little bit. There's some really interesting things going on at the Philanthropy Roundtable. Forgetting the name of the initiative they have. But
Culture of Freedom.
That's right.
And Will Hild will be here a bit later. So.
Oh, great, yeah.
We'll over lunch.
They're doing things in Jacksonville and a couple other cities where they're having some success with marriage promotion, which is, if you know anything about what the federal government has tried to do around marriage promotion, it's generally failed miserably. I forget the law, Rossi's law, applies, unfortunately, to marriage promotion, too, so far in government. But they're having real success with this private nonprofit program. And at least the folks there believe very strongly that the reason they're succeeding is because their entire strategy is oriented around churches. So it's the kind of thing where your neighbor says, haven't seen you in church, why don't you come to church? And we've got this this marriage program that's great. Why don't you just come once, no pressure, and well, come back next week. Like we've got cookies, blah blah blah, and it's leveraging social capital and social relationships. Whereas my understanding is that a lot of the marriage promotion stuff specifically, but sort of social policy generally, really makes it difficult for churches to have that active a role on the ground. I think that was absolutely the case with marriage promotion, and there are reasons for that, church and state considerations, but there's got to be some way to find a compromise where really the strongest institutions in local communities are like being shut out of some of these programs.
What's really happening is that the government has kind of shouldered aside those institutions that generate and communicate values and then wonders what went wrong. With respect to the Healthy Marriage Program and marriage promotion programs, the best program that's out there is called
Prep for Strong Bonds?
Prep for Strong Bonds, which was operated by Army chaplains during the Iraq surge. Prep for Strong Bonds caused a 50% reduction in divorce rate. I mean, it's just an astonishing program. There's a similar program like that that's run in churches called Prep for African Americans that had similar effects. And so the skills are there if you want to teach them. And also the constitutional law, which is if you allow individuals, if you, for example, went into a low-income community and said, say, in all the birth control centers that we have there, are you interested in marriage as a long-term part of your life? A lot of the women would say yes, much to the distress, I'm sure, of the people running those centers. But and so then offer them, okay, different types of programs, including the ability to offer a program that operates in a religious context. Simplest thing is when you're when you're talking about inner city communities, the most common thing you hear is, my kid was fine until he got involved with this gang on the street. Incidentally, the Crips and Bonds are part of civil society, so you need to know what type of civil society you're talking about, guys. So, but exactly the opposite of the Crips and Bloods is, in their studies on this, is the Sunday school. Okay, it's like a gang, It's the Sunday school gang, and the Sunday school gang not only has effect on the members of the Sunday school gang, but on the people that associate with them. It permeates outward. And we've sort of basically said, this isn't really important. Let's redistribute income. Let's get every child in Head Start that's worked so well. And we basically I think, are not concerned, because they're not really concerned about the well-being of these kids. You know, we spent a lot in Head Start in these programs. We're going to raise these kids. Well, actually, they're trying to raise their IQ. You know, wow, we're going to raise their IQ. Well, none of these programs actually work. They have no effect. The IQ does not change over time, and so forth and so on. There's a beautiful study in New Zealand, in a place called Dunedin, where they took 1,000 kids that were born in 1972, and you trace them all the way through their lives. And what you find is that the kids' cognitive ability has no effect on life outcomes. What has an effect on life outcomes is their character and their personality, which is shaped and measured by the time they're 4 or 5 years old. That affects their criminal activity, their failure in jobs, whether they have a divorce, whether they become drug abusers, and so forth. That type of character can be changed. But we don't care about it, okay? We have no interest in it. All we do is talk about how we want to make single moms work hard, and the left wants to redistribute income. And the poor are suffering is because of that. We need to go in and begin to deal with those things that really affect human outcomes and change them by paying for changes in outcomes. And the thing about character and personality and things like that, it's flexible. It can be changed over time, and if it does change, you see a measured improvement in outcomes. Basically, the welfare state doesn't care.
We are just reaching our time limit, so I want to give our guests, Scott and Paul, any final word on this panel.
Yeah, I guess I would just emphasize to watch for work coming out of our project on the family specifically. We kind of teed up a little bit our last report on opioids, where we showed that that less educated single men, some huge fraction of the increase in opioid mortality has come from single guys who are less educated, not single women who are less educated so much, not upper educated single guys, but that core group. And hopefully, as we do welfare reform next year, we can keep those guys in mind with things like SSDI reform and reforms in areas that affect them more too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and to just emphasize what Scott said, I mean, it's absolutely critical that, again, we take this broad approach. We take a more holistic approach and rethink the system itself. If we try to, I mean, there are lots of good things that we can do at the programmatic level. I'm not trying to push that aside. There are small changes that we can make to the way that current federal programs work. There are things that states can do, small changes they can make that would ultimately make the programs function better than they currently function. But ultimately, it's my opinion, and it's the opinion of many of my colleagues, that that we should go forth and do those things, but it shouldn't hold us back from doing something that's more fundamental. Mm-hmm. And like I mentioned at the onset of this, there's a lot of energy behind this. The Speaker of the House has mentioned publicly his commitment to doing welfare reform. I know it's very important to him. It's very important to his staff. I know that there's a lot of energy among the authorizing committees in both the House and the Senate in moving something forward on the welfare front. And as I mentioned, this is something that the President is absolutely committed to. He is very excited about doing. Got to get tax reform done first. But we will end up pivoting to welfare very quickly. So thanks for having us.
Yeah, we do look forward to a big welfare reform debate legislatively at the beginning of the new year, in addition to the executive branch kinds of things that Paul has shared with us today. We're going to be leaving the stage, and Genevieve Wood is going to come back and resume the podium. But will you join me in thanking our great panelists here today?
We're now at a very, the whole program is fun and good information, but this is really a fun and inspiring part of our program. And to get us started on this, it's going to be recognizing the Hope Award winner this year, which is put forward by World Magazine. So I'm delighted to introduce Jamie Dean. Jamie covers political and cultural issues as the national editor of World Magazine, which is a news organization whose mission is to produce biblically objective journalism that informs, educates, and inspires. And part of their commitment to inspiring includes their annual Hope Awards for Effective Compassion. Now, this is the 12th year they're going to be giving out the Hope Award, and we're delighted to recognize that 2017 winner here today. So to tell us more about the award and to announce this year's winner is Jamie Dean. Jamie, come on up.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, and it's an honor to be introducing our 2017 winner of World's Hope Award for Effective Compassion. World has been covering poverty fighting for decades, but over the last 12 years in particular, we've been sending reporters to cities all over the country to profile Christian organizations that are donor-funded and that are doing effective work in helping all sorts of people by addressing the whole person, as we've been hearing about this morning. Our mission at World is to provide biblically objective journalism, and the Bible has something to say about poverty fighting, just as it has something to say about journalism. So that's why we profile these groups. That's why we cover them in our magazine and on our website and in our daily podcast. And each year we invite our readers and our listeners to vote for a winner among a group of regional finalists that we highlight each year, with the winner receiving $15,000 from a donation provided by a world donor. Well, this year our winner is a school. Delta Streets Academy serves 60 predominantly African American young men in grades 7 through 12 in Greenwood, Mississippi, a town where half of the African American population lives below the official poverty line. The school's founder is Thomas McMillan Howard, but he is known all over town simply as T-Mac. T-Mac worked in a local public
1 2 3
school.
testing 1 2 3 check 1 2 3
I think I'm good.
test 1 2 3
He spotted me. Okay. T-Mac worked in a local public school where 1/3 of the students there were dropping out and were vastly underserved. So he started a school. He opened Delta Streets Academy in 2012 with a mission that he has described as equipping young men with the gospel of Jesus Christ and the skills needed to live a life that honors God. So a spiritual foundation combined with practical skills for a lifetime. One of the school supporters told us that he's gotten involved with Delta Streets because he's seen young men grow up without hope, without education, and fall into hopeless endeavors. He said it seems like an endless cycle. And then he said, I love Delta Streets because it is aimed at creating a new pattern. Well, we'd love for you to get an inside look at how Delta Streets goes about trying to help create these new patterns. So please join me in watching a short video about Delta Streets Academy.
I grew up with my mama and my sister, and I never had my father in my life. It was a little bit harder because I can see other people, their fathers, learning things that I should have knew, and I kind of had a jealousy towards that.
I mean, it's a backwards place. So there's a river that separates North Greenwood, South Greenwood, and North Greenwood's predominantly white, South Greenwood's predominantly black. 98% of the students that go to the public school are minority, and then probably 90% of the students that go to private school are white. I mean, churches are very segregated, and there's not a whole lot of crossovers.
My first year here was pretty hard, and I didn't think I was gonna come back next year. Just going through it, emotions and seeing things, and I was like, I need this school. Like, it wasn't a choice, it was like something I know I needed.
I feel like today I've learned way more than I would have known if I just went to a public school, because they don't really teach about God there. In the academics, Coach Howard just pushes that. He wants us to excel, he wants us to be something in this world and not just be the stereotypes that everybody thinks that we are, black people. that black people can't really do anything really good if they don't try or anything, that they just drop out of school, get on the streets.
They don't take care of their kids, we're not leaders, stuff like that.
There's a major lack of male leadership, specifically in the black community. I mean, I would even say just across all boards, but definitely in the black community. And so if we're gonna change the way Greenwood operates, because 60–70% of people that live in Greenwood are black, we need to equip young black men to rise up and be the men that God created them to be.
So my plans are tonight, let's go out, cook dinner with the pastor at his house.
He came and talked to me one day. He's like, man, he's like, you're my pastor. Like, I want to hang out with you. I was like, I think we can swing that.
So we're going to cook a Hollandaise sauce with homemade pasta.
The pastor who he's going to eat dinner with tonight has taken him under his wing.
It's interesting because Mississippi ranks last in a lot of things, but there's one thing that they rank first in, and that's giving, just in terms of giving. They're #1 in the United States in giving. There's been a tremendous amount of financial support for what they're trying to do. Probably the bigger need is the need for mentorships and people's time. You can't just write a check and be done, and that's I think where the big disconnect and where Delta Streets has really been good, is they've been a good bridge to help connect the people with the ministry.
Being at this school, I feel like people from the north side is like really helping out with this school because they know what's going on the south side, and they want to make that bridge so it can be crossed both ways, and like those two bridges can gap.
The challenge of operating a Christian organization in our world today can be very volatile because the media would not be a big fan of what we do here. Now, when we say the word success, it might not look to the world's eyes like they're successful, but if you love your wife and discipline your kids and stay committed in that relationship, it might look tough and hard, and it might not look like others if you can just get out of your marriage, but I mean, we would tell these guys that's super successful. If they follow through with what we teach them here, it should go well with them wherever they go.
Plan on graduating, going to Mississippi State, and later becoming a pharmacist.
Yeah, I plan to go to Mississippi State, try to be a doctor. I know it's going to be a long road, a lot of studying, everything, and hope it goes well for me.
I want to be able to move my family across the bridge. You know what I'm saying?
Our ultimate goal is to make sure these guys understand who Jesus is and what he's done for them and how that can radically transform their life and bring them hope in a sense where, oftentimes there seems to be no hope.
I say my faith gives me a strength to overcome things, because I know that I have somebody who loves me. That gives you so much strength knowing that, and be able to just get up in the morning and say, hey, I know what I need to do. I know I can do it, because I have that faith in somebody. It's like we're sitting in these chairs, we know they're gonna hold us. I know God will hold me as well.
Mr. Howard is with us this morning with his wife Megan, so please join me in welcoming and congratulating T. Mac Howard from Delta Street.
This will be quick. I'm not a big speaker. So Dr. Winship's peak of the day was the tweet, is that right? And so the peak of my day was
kind of rolled over into last night. We went to go eat at a fancy restaurant, and then my wife woke up and did spin class at Soul City, which she was pumped about, and then was able to get back into the bed this morning without our 3 little boys, and so everything else is good. Obviously, want to say a huge thanks to Heritage Foundation. I'm a little overwhelmed by just the whole. I mean, even just like you go into the bathroom and it's really fancy. And then, of course, World Magazine. The publicity has been phenomenal. One little disclaimer, World didn't necessarily pick us because like our school's awesome. We just have like amazing support all across the state and even just nationally, and so it was voted. And so the other 4 organizations probably should be up here, but we just had more votes. So thank y'all for having us.
Thanks, T-Mac, for coming, and thank you to Heritage for hosting us today. And if you're interested in reading more about Delta Streets Academy, there are copies of the World Magazine issue with that story in it on the table out here in the foyer. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jamie. What an inspiring story. That was beautiful. Thank you, T-Mac, to your wife for being here too. So it's appropriate that our final panel is actually going to be on education reform. So considering what we just saw, how education reform can ensure student success for life. And leading that panel will be Lindsay Burke, who's the director of Heritage's Center for Education Policy, and our Will Skillman Fellow in Education. Lindsay oversees research related to both federal and state education issues and policies, from preschool and K-12 to higher education reform. She devotes a good deal of her time in research to reducing federal intervention at all levels of education and empowering families with choice in education for their children. Ladies and gentlemen, Lindsay Burke.
Thank you. And I go ahead and welcome our panelists up as well. If you want to go ahead and come on up to the stage. We have a great panel this morning, and I'm really excited to be able to host everyone. We have, as I said, a phenomenal panel, and we're going to hear from each of them in short order. But I want to frame the conversation a bit this morning. And I'd like to start out by posing a question, rhetorical, but a question. What do we hope education reform will achieve? Understandably, many people would answer that question in terms of increased academic performance. And it is for good reason that they would answer that way. Just 34% of 8th graders across the country today are proficient in reading. For Black and Hispanic students, that number drops to 16 and 21% respectively. Data from the U.S. Department of Education's long-term trend study show that reading and mathematics achievement have largely stagnated over the past half century for high school seniors. Despite the many, many federal reform efforts from the mid-20th century forward, and there have been hundreds of federal programs since President Johnson launched the education component of his war on poverty. Despite these many programs, American students still rank in the middle of the pack internationally. If you look at 15-year-olds, they rank 25th, 24th, and 40th in science, reading, and mathematics achievement, respectively. And yet, we have spent $2 trillion over the past half century at the federal level alone. And remember, federal education spending is just 10% of everything that we spend. We've spent $2 trillion over the past half century on these reform efforts. But you can look close to home, close to DC, in fact, to see how this federal approach has utterly failed. This year, in Baltimore, 13 Baltimore schools had not a single student proficient in math. Not a single student in 13 Baltimore schools this year. So people have every reason to hope to see improvements in the academic outcomes being delivered or not delivered by the U.S. public education system. That's also why we are seeing such incredible and welcome growth in school choice across the country. In 2000, there were just 4 school choice programs, just as recently as 2000, in operation across the country. Today, there are 60 school choice programs in operation in more than half of states across the country. So we've seen dramatic growth. School choice policies, though, are doing far more than just improving academic outcomes. on the district schooling model, but they are making considerable improvements. So just to touch on a few, we have 17 rigorous studies today that have looked at the impact of school choice on academic achievement, and 11 of those have found significant increases in academic outcomes for participants. We have 3 that have looked specifically at the impact of school choice on graduation rates, and each of those rigorous evaluations find that graduation rates are elevated significantly for school choice participants. But education choice, of course, is and should be about far more than just improved academic outcomes. We know school choice does improve academic outcomes both for participants and non-participants, but it also improves the students' chances of graduating high school. But what we can't lose sight of is the need for education reform to do more than just graduate students who are proficient in math and reading achievement. So researchers have begun to examine what are the other effects of choice. We know now that school choice increases students' later life outcomes in meaningful ways, that it increases their chances of attending and persisting through college. It decreases students' chances of being involved in criminal activity. It improves their earnings potential, and it leads to parents who are more satisfied with their children's educational experiences. In other words, the benefits of education choice accrue to some of the most important aspects of our lives. School choice also has an impact on family dynamics, promoting parents, as University of Arkansas Professor Patrick Wolf has said, to move from the margins to the centers of their child's educational experience. Or, as Teresa, a mother of 3 who lives here in Washington, D.C., put it, when parents are able to choose the school for their children, you have people turning out just a little different in society. You start to solve the bigger problems too, she said. That's what happens when you turn control over education over from the government and into the hands of parents. That when you have not governments choosing school for your child, but you, as a parent, selecting into options that meet their unique learning needs. So, to answer the question that I posed earlier about what we hope education reform will achieve, I think it's a lot of things. Education reform is viewed and should be viewed as a means to achieving numerous important ends, as a means to fostering upward economic mobility, instilling civic values, engendering an appreciation for the arts and humanities, even strengthening national security, and imparting students with the knowledge and the skills necessary to pursue their life and career goals. And it goes much deeper. Education reform at its essence should serve as the vehicle through which the individual is able to attain his highest aspirations, and in so doing, elevates society and nudges human progress forward. It should prepare students to inherit the blessings and the liberties of a free society. So how do schools foster these ends? That's what we will hear about today from our excellent panel. Education reform and schools of choice in particular should model what Ron Haskins and Isabel Sawhill of the Brookings Institution have deemed the success sequence. Graduate high school, get a job, get married, and then have children. Dr. Wilcox's deep study of the success sequence has yielded invaluable findings about the impact adhering to this sequence can have on your future life outcomes. Just one data point from Dr. Wilcox's research, 97% of millennials who follow the success sequence do not end up in poverty once they reach their young adult life. So we'll hear today more about exactly what the success sequence looks like and how schools of choice prepare students to achieve it. So let me just quickly turn it over to our panel and introduce our 3 excellent panelists that we have today. First, we'll hear from Brad Wilcox. Brad Wilcox is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he directs the Home Economics Project. Inaugurated in the fall of 2013, the research project explores the links between family structure and economic growth in 20 countries around the world. More specifically, how marriage and a strong family life foster free enterprise. Dr. Wilcox is also an associate professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia, Law, and he directs the National Marriage Project at UVA. He is a fellow at the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor and has been a research fellow at Yale, a research associate at Princeton, and a Civitas Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He has a master's degree and a doctorate in sociology from Princeton and his bachelor's degree from UVA. We'll then hear from Derek Max, who is the co-founder and principal of Cornerstone Schools of Washington, D.C. It's a private, classically minded Christian school serving students from kindergarten through 12th grade. It's located in Southeast D.C. Prior to serving as Cornerstone's principal, Mr. Max was a program director at the Arthur DeMoss Foundation, was executive director of 2 programs leading the effort to privatize Social Security, and worked at both the Cato Institute and AEI. He also served as a staff economist at the Education and the Workforce Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives and as a speechwriter in the U.S. Senate. And then we are delighted to be able to talk a little bit with Amaria Jones, who is a junior at Cornerstone and has now been at Cornerstone for 3 years. So please help me welcome our panelists. So Brad, we'll kick it off with you. Could you talk to us a little bit? You have done, as I said, deep research into the success sequence. Can you explain it? What is the success sequence? What have you found in your research? What does that look like?
So with Wendy Wong, my colleague at IFS, we did a report called the Millennial Success Sequence this past summer. And as you indicated, what we're finding here is that, as Bell Sawhill and Ron Haskins at Brookings would predict, the younger adults, even today, who are following this sequence, who are getting at least a high school degree, who are working full-time in their 20s, and then marrying before having any children, are much more likely to steer clear of poverty and much more likely to sort of make their way into the middle class or upper class by the time they're in their late 20s or in their 30s. And so the idea, of course, is that sort of this tried and true sequence remains valid even for today's younger adults. So we find not only that 97% of them who follow the sequence are not poor, but that when you kind of look at the effect of following the sequence in kind of a more multivariate context, if you look, for instance, just at sort of at the idea of having a marriage before the baby carriage, your odds of being poor are 60% lower, even controlling for things like education, race, ethnicity, and age. So again, the idea here is that education, work, and marriage all kind of in their own ways affect young adults' economic well-being. And in terms of kind of connecting these findings to sort of the ed reform debate and ed reform conversation, I think one important takeaway here is that we have, in kind of the ed reform world, not focused as much as we might on the role of family in all of this, and that we need to do more to kind of bring the family strengthening crowd into conversation with the ed reform crowd, and to recognize how much they could work together. And of course, in making that point, I was reminded of James Coleman's groundbreaking report, Equality of Educational Opportunity, which is now more than 50 years old. And of course, in that report, in the 1960s, he is finding that a huge predictor of educational outcomes for kids is, family structure, parental education, family income. And so the idea here is that schools can and should do a lot more to strengthen the educational outcomes of kids. But they can only do so much. And if we don't do more to strengthen families in terms of both family structure and family process and family economics, we're not going to get as far as we could in bridging racial divides in American schools and also in bridging economic divides in American schools. And this point was driven home to me, I guess, in 2 ways, and then I'll stop. By work done by Bruce Bradbury and Jane Waldfogel, and their work on the educational gap, the SES gap here in American schools. And what they found was that the gap between kids from higher SES families and lower SES families at age 5 looks a lot like it does at age 18. Whereas these are kind of gaps that are sort of growing before a child actually enters into the formal school system oftentimes. And so if we're interested in trying to address these gaps, we need to sort of think about what can we do at home, before and outside of school to bridge these gaps. And then a second point is that work done both by David Autor and by my colleagues at the Institute for Family Studies indicates that there's a growing kind of a gender gap, obviously, where boys are more likely to be floundering in our schools today, particularly lower income boys. And what we're seeing in the work done by David Autor at MIT and by our work is that an important part of this gender gap has to do with family structure. And that lower income boys who don't have fathers in the home are particularly likely to be floundering at school. They're particularly likely to be suspended in school. We're seeing this in studies done in Florida and Arizona and elsewhere. And so if we're interested kind of both in not only addressing kind of this economic divide in our schools, but also kind of this gender divide in our schools, we need to be thinking a lot more about sort of strengthening families and figuring out ways to get more and more dads back into the home to help raise their kids and their sons in particular, and to be good role models for their kids and their sons in particular. And that unless and until we do that work of strengthening the family, of bringing more fathers into the picture, I don't think we're really going to make as much progress, or even much progress, as we otherwise might in bridging both those economic divides in American life, the racial divides in American life, and even the gender divides in American life when it comes to our schools. So that's why I think we need to think more about, how to strengthen families. And the final point here just would be, I think we need to think about ways in which schools can talk more about the success sequence and educate kids in both public and private schools about the importance of finishing high school at least, working full-time in your 20s, and then finally, marrying before having any children.
That's great. And I was actually going to ask you what you think schools could be doing to be more, especially within the district context, intentional about really advocating for the success sequence. But I'm also struck by the fact that so often you almost hear the district system dismiss poor outcomes because they say, well, it's not us, it's those families. We can only do so much. So, that we hear that critique a lot. And so I think thinking through that and then thinking about just the intentionality aspect of how schools can be proactive and actually advocating for the success sequence, do you think that that's something that, particularly within the district context, they can do successfully?
Well, I think there are a couple of challenges right around that issue. I think when you talk to administrators and educational leaders, there's a reluctance, an understandable reluctance to kind of address head-on these issues of sort of fatherhood and marriage as they relate to their kids. And there's a concern that they're going to be somehow insensitive or intolerant or otherwise stepping on toes in their local communities. But what some work that's been done by Ian Rowe up in New York City, he's a charter school CEO working in the New York City area, suggests that when you kind of actually talk to ordinary parents, even kind of single parents, they don't want their kids to end up typically as single parents. They would like to sort of see their kids kind of going down a different path. And so I think you can kind of articulate this in terms of we're not talking about kind of where people are at today in terms of their families, but kind of what kind of dreams and aspirations do you have for your own children? I think we can make a much stronger case that schools can and should talk about how can the kids in the school system sequence things differently so that they have greater opportunities educationally, professionally, and also in terms of their own family life going down. So kind of making the case in that way more palatable. And then, doing what we've done when it comes to things like teen pregnancy. We've actually have made tremendous strides in reducing teen pregnancy in the U.S. by more than 50% since 1990. Working in schools, working with the pop culture, MTV, the networks around that issue in particular. And I think we can kind of use that same, toolkit, both in terms of curriculum, but also in terms of more popular messaging outside of schools to kind of encourage younger adults, in particular, to put the baby carriage after marriage. And that if we do that, we can actually move the dial. So I would encourage both schools and other civic and public entities to kind of think more about public messaging around that issue.
So if we're thinking about how we define success, we can clearly define it in more than just economic terms. So Derek, I'd like to ask you, I know you have thoughts on how we think about success, how you personally define success, and how you think about it as the head of a school and what you hope your students will achieve. So how do you define future life success?
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. I should preface this by saying the comments that I'm giving today are my own. They don't necessarily reflect my board or my staff or my students, although, and they might not even reflect me if it's not well received. So, but generally, along with what Brad said, I don't believe you can address right thinking if you haven't addressed right living. Cornerstone is a classical school, and we're all about virtue, and the virtuous mind and the virtuous character. It's only then that you can really delve into the greater things that God has planned for us of learning. And so I'm guessing the students that I've brought here would say that maybe we talk too much about God's plan for their lives. And I do, as Brad said, I don't understand how as a public school, in some sense they're right when they say we can't do anything because the families, and give the excuse. If you can't talk to a student about being created by a God who loves them and cares for them and has a purpose for their life, if you can't tell them that God has given them a gender that is specific and purposeful and meaningful for them, that there is a boundary within which sex is a fantastic thing to be shared with your spouse for a lifetime, I don't know how you reach our kids. And so we focus a lot on right thinking. We have very rigorous academics, but we also embody that in right living. And I know I'm at an anti-poverty conference, but the truth is I'm not anti-poverty. I don't really care about some scale of income for my students. What I care about is that they grow up to know and love God passionately, and that they live virtuous lives, and whatever the circumstances they are in, they live with character and integrity, and they love their neighbor as themselves. And it doesn't matter ultimately what their dollar paycheck is. If they're living that life, our world will be much better off. I'm also more keenly aware, since getting out of the economist world and getting into the practical world, that the indications of poverty are often far more complex than we like to say. The circumstances of poverty are often not choices. And it's for that reason that we need to make sure that the students that we are educating have the values necessary to, and the strength necessary to face the challenges that may come their way. And what have we done if we've created students that have decent middle incomes and high incomes, but they're selfish and they lack integrity and they don't love their neighbor? I think we've wasted our time. And I will just close on this, just saying I think our culture is making it much harder to have the success sequence. I don't know how kids make it today with the technology that they have in their pockets, with the distractions and the lack of quiet and the inability to sleep, and single-family homes, and a culture that has a me-first mentality, and ask kids at their most vulnerable time in life to start pondering whether they're a male or a female. I just can't imagine a world in 20 years that is going to survive this if we continue down this path. God has a plan. My prayer is that our kids see that plan. You don't have to be a Christian to come to Cornerstone. I always tell them, my prayer is you are when you leave. And God has blessed us with a fantastic group of students and teachers who model Christian living. It's not uncommon to see our teachers praying with students between classes, staying late to help them in their subjects, but more importantly, just loving them and praying for them in isolation. So for me, the virtuous mind is the ultimate goal, and virtue centered on God's word.
To give the audience a better idea of how Cornerstone is situated, the environment in which many students from which they're coming into Cornerstone, we've talked at length before about some of the schools to which they would have been assigned had it not been for Cornerstone. Can you kind of contextualize that a little bit?
Sure, I can a little bit. We actually give an assessment to every student that applies to Cornerstone. And on that assessment, we determine their general grade level in 3 core subjects. We've given the test over the last 4 years to 150 students, and only 7 have graded proficient in all 3 subjects. Most of our students come in 2 grade levels behind. The horror stories, I always ask a parent when they come to Cornerstone, why are you changing schools? And the stories I hear become more bizarre every year from, my students is getting A's and B's but can't read. Or we had a student last year who literally had all A's in Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 and didn't know her times tables and couldn't find X if you gave it to her. And yet her parents were oblivious to this because she's been getting good grades. I honestly believe our schools are in worse shape than the data would suggest. If you go to Anacostia High School and they pull the fire alarm, they cancel school because it takes 2 hours to get back in through the metal detector, and they check your bags, and they have to pat you down. So depending on the time the fire alarm is pulled, they just don't let you come back into the school because the day is over. They can't get you back in time to learn. We have students, that will just tell you, they had math teachers that had no math training and didn't teach math. So the context is, we're taking kids, some of whom are in crisis, some of whom have more solid families that just need some place to support them. We believe parents are the first and most important teacher a child will ever have. The 3 students I have here today have parents who, if I'm not on them, they're on them, and are amazing. I think her mom is in the school more than I am. She loves Cornerstone. She invests not just in her daughter, but in all of our students. And so it's a team effort, and I think what you said about families is absolutely right. We have parent meetings where we have parent training seminars, and it's not uncommon for a parent to come in and say, Mr. Max, my son was caught doing this. I don't have a husband at home. Can you talk to him? And I'm glad to share about the path that they're on and hopefully guide them to God's design for their life. So.
That's great. So Amaria, can you help us think through, as a student at Cornerstone, what is it like for you? You came from a different school 3 years ago. You came to Cornerstone. What has it been like switching to a new school, meeting new folks at Cornerstone, having a principal like Mr. Max there every day? So what is the day-to-day like for you at Cornerstone, and what do you think is different about that school in particular?
I would say that I believe Cornerstone allows you to grow, if anything. The school that I had attended prior to Cornerstone was also a Christian school, but I do see a lot of different things that I guess I could weigh, compare, and contrast. But at Cornerstone, the teachers, they truly love you. A lot of people can say, they care, but the money can make them care. But the teachers, they take their time. And they nurture you, and it's not in a babying way, but it's in a way knowing that, like Mr. Max said, you're going to need God, and they allow you to establish different things within your life. I believe Cornerstone the last 3 years has allowed me to expand the horizons and the way I do things and things I've been able to see. My mom, she exposes me to a lot of different places and a lot of different events, but Cornerstone has helped me further that. And I believe as well, with God being such a huge factor there's not a day where you don't hear about God. The teachers, we pray in the morning, we do prayer requests, my friends, we talk about God in and out of class and stuff like that. So I'm free to worship. I'm free to do things that at a public school I would not be able to do. If I were to go to my ward school, it would be Anacostia, and I know people who go there. And I'm not going to say that it's the worst thing in the world, but it can't always be pleasant. And even at a Christian school, there are challenges, but knowing that you have God to rely on, you go back to the source. It's not just another person or a teacher. And then you just feel the realness. And because we're such a small school, it's close-knit, and we do have love. Of course, there's hard times where you're like, oh, man. Or Mr. Max might not, you might rub each other the wrong way, but at the end of the day, you know that there's God, and you can feel the true personalities of the people that you are around every day. So I think in the last 3 years, I've been allowed to grow at Cornerstone, to anchor my relationship with God, and to reestablish who I am. And I've been able to set goals about where I want to go and who I want to be in the next year. So, yeah, I believe that's what Cornerstone is.
That's fantastic. And at the risk of putting my own job in jeopardy, you've said it way better than any policy paper could ever say why it's important to have choice in education. So you just mentioned your sort of future life trajectory. What are you thinking? What do you want to do?
So I want to be a writer. I like creative writing, anything with poetry, spoken word, but I'm also looking at something maybe a bit more serious, because I know it can be kind of tedious choosing one thing and not being able to further advance in that subject. So if not writing, I think I would like to try to find something in science.
That's excellent. Both very, very good choices. We mentioned choice a second ago. So two questions. One for Brad. So in terms of research needs at the moment, you hit on something earlier that I think is absolutely right. My world is in the school choice community by and large, and that's a community that I think has not necessarily always thought about family formation and the intersection between the two. So what do you think in terms of the need for future research, how those two communities could sort of bridge that research divide? Where do you think the greatest needs are right now?
Well, I think it's important for us to, as we're thinking about kind of the long-term effects of school choice and also just different types of schooling, is to try to figure out what impact both is school choice having on family formation in terms of, marriage, non-marital childbearing, age at first birth, these kinds of family formation outcomes. And then thinking too about which types of schooling are more likely to foster, down the road marriage, down the road having kids within marriage. And we haven't really studied those, kinds of links. We do know, for instance, when it comes to vocational education, that young men who've gone through career academies are more likely to be not only kind of doing better when it comes to earnings and work relative to their peers with similar backgrounds, but also are more likely to be married as younger adults. So that's sort of one suggestive piece of information on this question. But again, I think we need to think a lot more about the way in which choice, may or may not affect family formation in ways that are important and valuable. And then of course, as we kind of explore this, I think also trying to encourage public schools, charter schools, private schools, religious schools to be more intentional about preparing their students not only for higher education, for work, but also for family life. And really, since the 1970s, we've done such a bad job when it comes to kind of the domestic arts and when it comes to relationships, I think, as well. So things like budgeting, things like home maintenance, things like cooking, as well as things like communication, conflict, and marriage are things that need to be, I think, either stressed more or reintroduced into our schools as well.
You had a thought on
I was just gonna, I do think a lot about what, in trying to develop the virtuous student, it does just prepare you for marriage and life in a lot of ways. At our school, we don't yell at students. One of our philosophies with teachers is a well-managed classroom. The students should be treated with dignity and respect, and the teachers should be treated with dignity and respect. So I don't need to yell at a student to redirect them. I can guide them non-verbally. And if they can't get that, then they've themselves have asked not to be a part of the community. And that is such an important thing for marriage. I mean, our students are taught how to have conflict in a sensible way. Soleil here, for example, we've had some issues in the past where we go back and forth, but one of the models at Cornerstone is that we don't do a lot of lecturing. We do a lot of integrated learning where the students read and engage and debate. It has to be done in a respectful and honorable manner. And that all goes to make you the kind of person that someone would want to marry. I've had kids ask me, Mr. Max, did you let your son marry a Cornerstone student? I'm always like, I'd be honored. Because I know you kids are, you're prepared. You've seen the virtuous life. And so, a lot about the way, and just the love component. We talk about loving one another. At Cornerstone, if you're walking down the halls, you'll actually hear staff and students telling each other they love each other. Because I've said, if you do it, show it, but you should also just say it. Because every now and then, it's nice to say, Mari, I love you. Those words they do something to you. And I think it's commanded by God. And so, if they're in a marriage where they're telling their spouse they love them regularly, and aren't yelling and can resolve conflict in a positive way, man, we have gone a long way. And lastly, we have men's and women's ministry where we can talk about issues of life because it is hard. Yes, it's hard out there, right, Elijah? And we can talk from a Christian perspective about the issues of the day, whether that be race, whether that be sex, any of the challenges. where we can just address it in an open way and give our views from the scripture, and they can share back their response to that. And I think ultimately that is family formation. We are, as she said, a family at Cornerstone. I pray that that leaks into their families when they're older.
I could listen to each of you talk all day long, but would love to open it up if you have questions. We have a few minutes left to take a few audience questions. If anybody has one, just raise your hand.
We answered everything.
Yes, Patrice.
Hi, Patrice Nwuka with the Independent Women's Forum. Earlier you started talking about, and I read your piece on marriage sequencing. I think it's fantastic for millennials. But in terms of low-income young men and boys and the lack of male influence, how do we start to beat back against that? Because I think some of the challenges that we receive as a women's organization talking about marriage and family and the importance, especially in a minority community, is that, well, not everybody falls into that category. And especially when you look at black female women today, most of them are not married, but they're still having kids. And they think it's okay now to start having kids without having a male presence in their life. So how do we continue to talk about the marriage sequence or the success sequence in terms of marriage?
That's a great question. I think I guess I'll make 3 points. One is it's important to recognize that one of the things that we did in the Success Sequence report, which you probably saw, is that we find that the sequence, shall we say, works for younger adults from a wide range of different backgrounds. So it works for younger adults from lower income families. It works for young adults who are Latino. It works for young adults who are African American. So what we find is that kind of young adults who are, say, African American, for instance, are much more likely to be flourishing financially if they follow the sequence. So the idea here is that even though there are obviously differences in kind of rates and levels, the basic story holds across racial and across economic lines. And so if we could make the success sequence more common among both young adults from lower income families and also young adults from the African American community, that would, I think, have a big impact. The second thing, I think, is to sort of try to get people to think about, well, even if, say, their own parents or their own communities haven't been sort of following the sequence, on average, if they haven't had kids yet, they can pursue a different path. And that may mean, looking outside of their own social network for spouses, including also looking across racial lines. I think that's an important point to be made. So just sort of like encouraging this idea that people do have agency, and they can make different choices for themselves. And then if they're concerned about the welfare of any future kids that they might have and the welfare of their community, they should be trying to think about strategies for making different choices. But the final point I guess I would make is it's not just about kind of personal responsibility and personal agency, that we also need to be thinking about ways to strengthen opportunities for African American boys and lower income boys more generally. And that we need to be thinking about schools like Cornerstone as one model, but also thinking too about doing a lot more when it comes to vocational education and apprenticeship training. Because there are a lot of unfilled jobs, out there in IT, in high-tech manufacturing, in sort of nursing and medicine, et cetera, that we're not really equipping our kids who are not in the college track for. And I think our schools could do a much better job of doing more on the vocational apprenticeship tracks that would then make young adults in general, but also young adults from lower income and African American and working class white and Hispanic communities as well more marriageable. So to sort of try to increase the economic opportunities that young adults have, and young men in particular have, that would make them think of themselves more as marriageable and would make them more attractive too as potential husbands.
Well, if you haven't had a chance to read Brad's paper, it's wonderful on the success sequence, and you can Google it. It's out there. Really just an accessible and well-done research report, so definitely commended to everyone. But thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to the panelists. Just really informative and interesting, and like I said, I could listen to you all day long. But since we can't do that, we'll have to adjourn, so please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, Lindsay, as well, and thank you all very much for being here. This does conclude our formal program, but as we love to do at all Heritage events, we like to feed everyone before you leave. So as you go downstairs, we do have restrooms by the elevators. I know there was mention of how nice they were up here. These are the nicest restrooms around the 7th floor, just so you know. But we also have restrooms on the 1st floor, and down there we'll be providing box lunches, so those who have time to stay to share lunch, share conversation, we invite you to do that, and you'll find people outside directing you down. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here.